The nature lovers can't have a conversation with the economists because the economists think in a very different lens. Okay? Like you talk to an infrastructure specialist and it's all about, I care about infrastructure, I don't care about trees. Urban space, maybe nature is like a blessing for a lot of people. But rural areas, maybe nature is a disguise. Nature means different things for different places and we need to acknowledge the privilege. But benefits range from mental health, physical health, like you're toned, you're like out in nature, mental health in terms of clarity of your mind. In the UAE, greenery is not nature. In fact, I mean, it's actually bad for the environment if you're planting non-native trees because it consumes more water. होइन तर UAE जस्तो ठाउँमा चाहिँ नेचर भने के हो बालुवा नै नेचर हो नि
कमन सबैले सजेस्ट गर्ने चाहिँ बी क्लोज टु द नेचर भन्छ क्या
अनि अहिलेसम्म कोहीले पनि हुन्छ नि अब थाक्यो त भन्छ तर कोहीले पनि यो चाहिँ मेरो एकदम स्ट्रेस भयो नेचरमा अहिलेसम्म आई हैव नेभर एक्सपिरियन्स दैट के
किताबमा छ अनि टिचरले भनेको थियो बाट लर्निङ हुँदैन के
अब पर्टिकुलर किन्डरगार्टनहरु चाहिँ चिटिक्क पुरा नेचरको त्यो जनावर कहिले नदेखेको जनावर हुन्छ हैन तर यु जस्ट स्टेप आउट हैन अब त्यही स्कुलको ठ्याक्कै बाहिर दे विल बी लाइक 10 स्ट्रीट डग्स they will never have a conversation on what it means to have street dogs.
नमस्कार एजुकेशन डायलगमा स्वागत छ आज हामीसँग हुनुहुन्छ राष्ट्र राज भण्डारी Rashtra is an environmental economist and outdoor enthusiast. As we are going to discuss on why human interaction with nature is important and how we can integrate it into education. Swagat sir, Rashtra.
Thank you, Dai.
Thank you so much for joining.
No, it's great to be
How
here.
How are you doing?
All good, Dai. It's busy. Work is busy. Trying to do a lot of nature stuff. Cycle, hike, work, so managing everything.
So, सुरु चाहिँ अब तिम्रो यो भनौँ न इन्भाइरोमेन्टसँग आउटडोरसँगको यो भनौँ न त्यो प्रतिको माया लगाव चाहिँ कसरी डेभलप भयो भन्ने
हजुर नो द्याट्स अ ग्रेट क्वेसन दाइ एन्ड आई थिङ्क त्यो चाहिँ अब अभियसली इट हेज टु गो ब्याक टु व्हेन आई वाज भेरी यङ अनि बच्चैदेखि नै आई थिङ्क आई वाज एक्सपोज टु अ लट अफ नेचर अनि आई वाज भेरी लकी बिकज वी युज टु लिभ इन गोदावरी अनि त्यो हुँदा बित्तिकै लाइक वी ग्रो अप अ लट अराउन्ड ट्रिज अ लट अराउन्ड वाइल्ड लाइफ अ लट अराउन्ड इन्सेक्ट्स अनि आई हेड अ फेसिनेसन फर द्याट त्यो चाहिँ एउटा त्यो पर्सनल फ्यामिली कम्पोनेन्टले गर्दाखेरि अनि अर्को चाहिँ फ्रम अ यङ एज आई युज टु रिड अ लट आई वाज भेरी इन्ट्रेस्टेड इन बुक्स आई वाज भेरी इन्ट्रेस्टेड इन सोर्ट लाइक टिभी भन्दा पनि आई वाज भेरी इन्ट्रेस्टेड इन डकुमेन्ट्रिज अनि पहिला म बच्चा हुँदाखेरि चाहिँ यो स्टिभ अर्विनको डकुमेन्ट्री आउँथ्यो कि लाइक क्रोकोडाइल डायरिज राइट अनि हि वाज जस्ट लाइक सुपर कुल अस्ट्रेलियन गाई वाज डुइङ अल दिस लाइक क्रोकोडाइल स्टफ अनि सो अलिकति मिडिया उसमा पनि एकदमै थियो लाइक नेचरको त्यो एकदम इन्ट्रेस्ट थियो अनि स्कुल पढ्दाखेरि पनि इभन फ्रम अ करिकुलम अनि स्पोर्ट्स पोइन्ट अफ भ्यू आई वाज डुइङ अ लट अफ स्पोर्ट्स आई वाज डुइङ अ लट अफ साइक्लिङ अनि करिकुलममा पनि आई वाज फर द इको क्लब अनि थिङ्स लाइक द्याट सो सबै त्यसरी नै स्टेज हुँदै गयो सो इट वाज नट जस्ट एउटा कम्पोनेन्ट तर फ्यामिलीबाट पनि युज हुन्छ नि लाइक दिस इज इम्पोर्टेन्ट फर यु भन्ने खालको त्यो नेरेटिभ अनि स्कुलबाट पनि आई वाज लकी इनफ टु गो टु अ स्कुल वेयर नेचर वाज लाइक अ बिग कम्पोनेन्ट अनि त्यसपछि इभन फ्रम अ एकाडेमिक इन्ट्रेस्ट from the books I read, from sort of the documentaries I watched. So I think the तीनटा combination, I think it really cemented a foundation for nature in multiple ways.
Great. So कस्तो खालको benefits हरु हुँदो रहेछ त?
त्यो चाहिँ I think पछि गएर मात्र थाहा हुँदो रहेछ के, right? Because like when you're young, it feels part of you in some ways. तर also, although मेरो लागि चाहिँ that was a एकदमै strong narrative, एकदम strong part of who I was. That wasn't the case for a lot of my friends. होइन मेबी स्कुलमा थियो होला एउटा कम्पोनेन्ट थियो होला तर मेबी फ्यामिलीमा त्यो कम्पोनेन्ट थिएन होला मेबी इफ दे वर लिभिङ इन काठमाडौँ अनि दे डिडन्ट ह्याभ द्याट इन्भाइरोमेन्ट सो सुरुमा चाहिँ अलिकति चाहिँ व्हेन आई वाज यङ इट वाजन्ट अ कुल थिङ टु डु होइन तर अहिले आएर हेर्दाखेरि चाहिँ कम्प्लिटली चेन्जेस यो पर्सपेक्टिभ के अनि बेनिफिट्स चाहिँ अब म चाहिँ आइ एम भेरी भोकल अबाउट दिस होइन मेरो पर्सनल लाइफमा त अब बेनिफिट्स रेन्ज फ्रम मेन्टल हेल्थ physical health, like you're toned, you're like out in nature, mental health पनि in terms of clarity of your mind. अनि अरू दुई तीनवटा चाहिँ अरू एकदम इन्ट्रेस्टिङ कुराहरू दाइ एउटा चाहिँ creativity, right? Because you're more creative. अनि if you're always sitting inside an office space, you lose your creativity के अनि फोर्थ चाहिँ मैले अस्ति भर्खर I was reading an article about this and he was talking about how humans have evolved in such a way that we're losing our senses के
right
हैन अब जनावरहरूको जुन सेन्सेस छ नि त्यही अनुसार हामीले चाहिँ हाम्रो सेन्सेसहरू बोलिरहेको छ लाइक सेन्सेस टु हियर सेन्सेस टु स्मेल वाट डज नेचर स्मेल लाइक सो त्यस्तो कुराहरूमा पनि अब वेन आइम रनिङ आफ्टर द रेन एन्ड स्टफ the sense that I get and stuff is just very, very interesting. So benefits are mere like say personal, professional, academic, mental health, physical health, एकदम त्यो holistic नै भन्छु म
तिमी त सहरमा भन्दा यताउता साइक्लिङ र दौडिनेमै व्यस्त भइरहेको
हजुर I try अलिकति
तर त्यति धेरै महत्त्वपूर्ण हुँदा पनि अब तिम्रो आफ्नो एक्सपिरियन्समा चाहिँ हाम्रो एजुकेसनले चाहिँ कसरी यसलाई हेरेको देख्छौ
यो चाहिँ त it's very interesting because अब म पनि स्कुल पढ्दाखेरि it wasn't something I thought beyond me, I know. But only when I went to university and when I traveled quite a lot, and when I was exposed to other cultures different than ours, then I realized how important this is and how systematic this is in many places. Okay, and त्यो systematic को चाहिँ दुईटा कुराले हुँदो रहेछ एउटा चाहिँ culturally पनि अनि अर्को चाहिँ pedagogically पनि education schools देखि नै when you're taught हुन्छ नि a relationship with nature and interaction with nature and the benefits it has. Then it's a completely different experience. Okay? And it's your link between the first question, my personal story, how is this important on a broader scale? Say, त्यतिखेर भयो किन भन्दाखेरि मेरो experiences it's proven by science as well. Okay? So there's a lot of research on nature deficit disorders. I know nature deficit bhayera like the struggles people go through. Like I was reading this book and त्यहाँ चाहिँ के भन्यो भन्दाखेरि compared to हाम्रो parents को generation globally. We're experiencing nature 3 times less. Okay? So I say 25-21% young people get to experience nature, and our parents' generation was 70-72%. And so I also understood there's science behind this. I know. And your benefits and sort of like broader things. Say, I understood this is something that's beyond me.
I think like you raised a very, very important point here. I know, but just the मैले पनि सुनिरहेको छु देखिरहेको छु आजकल चाहिँ किनभने स्ट्रेस लेभल एकदमै हाई छ एन्जाइटी हैन धेरै नै अहिले ग्लोबली पनि नेपालमा पनि स्पेशली झन् यो आफ्टर आई मिन पोस्ट कोभिड त एकदमै नै म्यासिभ आई सी अ लट अफ लाइक इभन युथ्सहरू एकदम स्ट्रेस्ड हैन एकदम एन्जाइटी किनभने घरभित्र बस्यो अनि त्यस पछाडि तिम्रो ग्याजेट्सहरूसँग खेल्यो स्क्रिनमा बस्यो अनि त्यसले गर्दाखेरि नेचरसँगको प्रक्सिमिटी जुन घट्दै गयो नि अनि जति पनि मैले त्यो स्पिरिचुअल मान्छेहरूसँग हैन काउन्सलरसँगहरूसँग अनि गफ गर्दाखेरि वान थिङ कमन सबैले सजेस्ट गर्न चाहिँ बी क्लोज टु द नेचर भन्छ क्या हैन सो त्यसमा would you like to elaborate alikati ajai further?
No, exactly. So my didi is a psychiatrist, right? And she works with especially young children in mental health and stuff. And so malai chai paहिले dekhi nai like mental health was a very, very strong and integral component of why I do it. अनि मेरो understanding ma मेरो research अनुसार चाहिँ अनि मेरो personal space ma चाहिँ I see a visible difference with me being out in nature and मेरो mental health and I do therapy as well. So all of that, मेरो लागि चाहिँ I see a visible difference. But I also don't want to say like closeness to nature is a solution for mental health because mental health is so much more deep and it's so profound than what a lot of people understand it to be. You know? So I don't think it's like a solution for mental health crisis. But I do think for certain people, it might be something that helps them create some sort of calmness, both in their mind, in their spirituality, as well as in their body, when they're out in nature. And म पनि like अब त्यो scientific experience त त्यस्तो छैन तर I take a lot of friends out. Okay? So when I go out, like cycling, hiking, nature ma, a lot of my friends want to do it as well, and I take them. अनि अहिलेसम्म कोहीले पनि हुन्छ नि अब थाक्यो त भन्छ तर कोहीले पनि यो चाहिँ मेरो एकदम स्ट्रेस भयो नेचरमा अहिलेसम्म I've never experienced that. Okay? So अब कुनै अब एकदम difficult trail भयो भने अलिकति स्ट्रेसफुल हुन्छ तर everyone comes out of it happy.
त्यो थकान र त्यो अर्को स्ट्रेस एकदमै ठुलो डिफरेन्स छ हैन त्यो भन्छ नि मजा लाग्ने खालको दुखाइ भयो त्यो चाहिँ हैन थकाइ तर अर्को चाहिँ अल्टिम मजा नलाग्ने खालको अनप्लेजेन्ट थकाइ
एक्ज्याक्टली
एउटा चाहिँ तिमी अब क्लाइमेट फाइनान्सिङ अनि क्लाइमेट यो चेन्ज भने एकदम धेरै काम गरिराखेको भएर मलाई अर्को एउटा डाइमेन्सन चाहिँ त्यो पनि कता एडुकेसनसँगै रिलेटेड छ जस्तो लाग्छ किनभने बिकज हामीलाई एजुकेसनले कहिले पनि त्यसको महत्त्व नै बुझाएन भने हुन्छ नि पार्ट अफ द त्यो इन्टेग्रल पार्ट अफ आवर लाइफ इन्टेग्रल पार्ट अफ आवर लर्निङ भनेर त बनाएन नि एड अन तिमीले एउटा एको क्लब हुनु यो गर्नु द्याट्स अ डिफ्रेन्ट इस्यु होइन बट देन लाइक इट्स भेरी भेरी इम्पोर्टेन्ट इन्टेग्रल पार्ट भनेर त बनाएन सायद त्यही कारणले चाहिँ होला कि हामीले नेचरलाई माया गर्नै नै जानेनौँ जोगाउनै जानेनौँ अब आज हामीले जुन सफर गरिरहेको छौँ नि लुक एट लाइक काठमाडौँ भ्याली लुक एट लाइक हुन्छ नि हामीले जति पनि नेचरलाई सकाइराखेको छौँ अहिले क्लाइमेट चेन्जको इम्प्याक्ट हामीलाई परिराखेको छ सायद त्यसमा पनि तिम्रो एकदम आई नो लाइक यु हेभ अ लट अफ थट्स अन दैट
Yeah, I do. No, that's a great question, right? And I think this is something I've been trying to wrap my head around as well in terms of what does it mean for us, many levels. I'm going to ask some questions to myself and just for food for thought. So what does nature mean? First question. And what does interaction with nature mean? Second question. And like when you go to school in Nepal, we're taught from a very young age, we're like a nature abundant country. I know about the Himalayas. I know what's the thing? We're the second largest source of fresh water in the world, right? So we're taught all of these things. तर त्यो हुँदा हुँदै पनि it's somehow very detached from majority of the Nepalis. Okay? And when you start going deeper to this, a couple of patterns emerge. First, almost like 72%, I can't get the stats right, that of people in Nepal live in urban spaces, like Kathmandu. अब काठमाडौँ जस्तो ठाउँमा त्यत्रो पर्सेन्टेजको मान्छेलाई नेपालमा 43% फरेस्ट कभर छ भनेको हाउ डु यु रिलेट टु द्याट हैन अब म बाहिर युनिभर्सिटी पढ्दा पनि लाइक द फर्स्ट क्वेसन पिपल आस्क व्हिच आई थिंक अ लट अफ पिपल क्यान रेजोनेट विथ इफ दे स्टडीड अब्रॉड इज हैव यु बीन टु एभरेस्ट हैन तर अ लट अफ अस राइट लाइक वी हार्डली गो ट्रेकिङ मेबी इट्स गेटिङ बेटर अहिले अलिकति आई सी मोर एन्ड मोर तर
पनि अलिकति एलिट क्लास
त्यो पनि लाइक हुन्छ नि अलिकति अब यङ उ भएर जम्न भन्ने छ तर नट फ्रम अ यङ एज के सो त्यो नेचर भने कि वर रिच भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ किताबमै मात्र बस्यो कि सो आई डु थिङ्क वर टट तर द थिङ इज इट्स नट समथिङ द्याट सुड बी टट इट्स समथिङ द्याट वी निड टु एक्सपिरियन्स अनि आई थिङ्क द्याट्स वेयर अघि पनि आई टुक नोट्स यु सेड द वर्ड प्रक्सिमिटी के सो द वर्ड प्रक्सिमिटी इज भेरी इन्ट्रेस्टिङ बिकज हाम्रो चाहिँ पेडागोजी अनुसार नै हाउ डु वी थिङ्क नेचर होइन अनि वाट लेभल्स अनि वाट डाइमेन्सन्स भन्ने कुरामा चाहिँ वी निड टु रिथिङ्क And I think the problem lies from a very young age, okay? The way like nature is taught to us. And we're told that we have it, and it just ends there, so we never question. Maybe we're going to question it, we're going to go out to see what it is. But when we're told, oh, it's there, it's in your backyard, you take it for granted. Okay? So I think it starts from there. And I'll give you a funny example. And when I was in school, अब केही बदमास गऱ्यो भने जाऊ 10 ल्याप उसमा गएर दौडेर आऊ भनेर इट वाज अ पनिशमेन्ट होइन म युनिभर्सिटीमा जाँदाखेरि 10 ल्याप भनेको त ओहो युआर वर्किङ आउट होइन युआर लाइक टेकिङ केयर अफ यर सेल्फ सो इट्स अल्सो द वे लाइक हुन्छ नि बिङ आउटडोर्सी बिङ एडभेन्चरस लाइक बिङ लाइक इन्टु स्पोर्ट्स इज ट्रिटेड के अनि इट्स नट अ बिग थिङ इट्स जस्ट अ म्याटर अफ सिफ्टिङ हाउ the narrative is on a lot of these things.
अर्को चाहिँ सँगै एसोसिएट पनि हुने हामी डिस्कस पनि गरेर हुन्छ नि अहिले तिमीसँग चाहिँ के नेचर अनि आउटडोर एडभेन्चरसँग रिलेटेड चाहिँ तिम्रो फिटनेस पनि छ नि त होइन अहिले कतिपय मान्छेहरू फिट छैन नि त सो वान अफ द रिजन्स त त्यो पनि होला नि हामी त्यो फिटनेसलाई पनि त इन्टेग्रल पार्टै बनाएन कि होइन हामीले एजुकेसन र मैले फेरि हेल्थको पनि हेऱ्यो भने फेरि इन्टरकनेक्टेड पनि छ कि होइन हामीले हेल्थ साइन्स भनेर चाहिँ पढायौँ राइट सो हेल्थ एजुकेसन भनेर तर आफ्नै हेल्थको विषयमा चाहिँ खासै हामीले डिस्कस गरेको अनि कस्तो छ तिम्रो हेल्थ कसरी आफ्नो हेल्थ मेन्टेन गर्ने वाइ फिटनेस इज रियली इम्पोर्टेन्ट हाउ क्यान यु वी डु इट भन्ने कुराको चाहिँ फेरि त्यो इन्टेग्रल पार्ट अफ आवर करिकुलम हुँदैन सकेन क्या है
त्यही अब त्यो फिटनेस इज अनदर कन्भर्सेसन आइ एम नट अ फिटनेस एक्सपर्ट तर मेरो लागि चाहिँ इट्स अबाउट ग्राउन्डिङ के सो इट्स नट अबाउट फिटनेस एज मच एज इट्स अबाउट ग्राउन्डिङ यर सेल्फ to the reality, which is nature, which is part of us. That's where we come from. That's where we're going to go. I know. And so for me, fitness is, I love endurance. I do a lot of marathons and endurance sports, and I love fitness. But it's never about doing it, body ramra banaunu paryo. But it's about when you're running 50 kilometers in an intense forest, the way you perceive that forest is very different on that 47th kilometer compared to the first kilometer. Okay? Right? The way you see that forest for me is different every day I go. Pani pareko din, it's a completely different space. When it's slippery, it's different. And when it's very hot outside and I go in and there's shade, it's completely different. And अहिले पनि के अब त्यो we don't have a lot of trees in Kathmandu. तर दिउँसो 12 बजेको घाममा every रुखको पनि कोही न कोही बस्या हुन्छ के because that's the only shade we have. Right? So मेरो लागि fitness is very important. तर I think also like fitness is very special for me because I get to do it in nature.
तर त्यही त म त्यो गर्दाखेरि मेरो दिमागमा चाहिँ के चलिरहेको थियो भन्दाखेरि नेपालमा चाहिँ अर्ली एजमा यस्तो हेल्थको कुरा गर्नु अन्त नेचरको कुरा गर्नु नेचरलाई केयर गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ अलिकति यो बुढेसकालको कन्भर्सेसन भने जसरी
once you lose that
Absolutely.
तर sorry I'll interject there हैन अब त्यसमा पनि I don't want to come off as like categorizing all of our experiences only in the urban space ni ta right अब नेपालमा पनि गाउँहरुमा when you go and you see sarkari schools where like kids are walking for 3 hours just to get to school right for example but the interaction with nature is very like very significant.
True.
Right, so it's not just about that one dimension, okay? It's not just about being in nature,
right.
So it's more about the holistic sort of point of view of what does it mean, I know, to be in nature, both for people in urban areas, the kids in urban areas, they're also for kids in rural areas. Right, so uniralai pani the way nature is portrayed is it's an obstacle to education, right? And in many ways hamro just geography ma it is. But त्यसमा पनि we need more research on how do you portray that, okay?
So त्यसैसँग रिलेटेड अर्को कुरा भने चाहिँ त्यही कारणले पनि हाम्रो ब्रडर अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङहरू ल्याक गरिरहेको छ नि त होइन हाउ द ह्युम्यानिटी एन्ड वाइ बेसिकली दिस इकोलोजी एन्ड इकोसिस्टम इज रियली इम्पोर्टेन्ट हाउ इट वर्क्स भन्ने कुरालाई यु नेभर बिन देयर मिनिङ लाइक यु डोन्ट अप्रिसिएट इट नि त होइन त्यही कारणले पनि हामी सायद माया गर्न जानेनौँ त्यसलाई होइन कसरी त्यसले नै हामीलाई सपोर्ट गरिरहेछ हामी इन्टेग्रल पार्ट हो भनेर हामीले बुझ्नलाई साँच्ची नै सकेको छैन क्या मैले यु सी लाइक लड अफ युथ्स जसले साँच्चीकै यो नेचरलाई बचाउनुपर्छ भन्ने भइदियो सायद हाम्रो सहरहरू यति फोहोर पनि हुन्थेन
त्यही त अनि थ्याङ्क्स फर फ्ल्यागिङ द्याट बिकज आई थिङ्क हाम्रो सोल्युसन्स नै एकदमै त्यो ब्यान्डेड सोल्युसन्स भयो कि राइट अनि दिस इज वेयर एजुकेसन कम्स इन because I work in finance, right? I'm not an education expert, but I'm a strong believer that if we need long-lasting, sustained change and not just like band-aid solutions, it needs to start early. Right? I know. About the waste issue is fundamentally there, okay? Right. About waste cool thing is because I travel a lot for work as well. Waste is very tied with two things, like cultural and education. And what is the status quo? And if you go to Japan, for example, culturally, you recycle. You don't waste. Education. School dekhi kids are taught how to recycle. And that's complemented by a very robust infrastructure. Because it's not just about recycling at school, but the different streams also get like recycled and repurposed and composted differently. And the third thing, which is very, very important, is what is the status quo? Everyone recycles. But Nepal, we lack all three of those things. Okay? And the problem becomes, we're taught, oh, like nature is great, but we can never relate to how we're part of nature, what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, how does that contribute to the broader things. We're not connected to maile gharma phalne plastic eventually goes to Bagmati, even though maybe we know this, but knowing versus experiencing it is completely different, right?
Exactly.
Classma bhanera matra versus you experiencing it by yourself is different, right? So mero lagi chahi a lot of these things, I think they have to start from a very young age. They need to start from school. It's about culture, it's about family, it's about education, it's about pedagogy. And all of that needs to be stitched together by experiential learning. It's not just about academic textbook learning, it's about experiential learning.
Yeah, you brought up a very, very important point. त्यही कारणले त हामीले म एज एन एजुकेटर हाम्रो एजुकेसनको समस्या भने नै भन्नेवाला एजुकेसन भयो क्या किताबमा छ अनि टिचरले भनेको थियो बाट लर्निङ हुँदैन कि have you experienced it? Have you gone through that process? One. Two, say, has your school lived that? Has your teacher lived that? त्यसले पो हो नि त मैले के सिक्छु भने त किड्सले त कसरी सिक्छ त भन्दाखेरि वाट्स गोइङ अराउन्ड लाइक हुन्छ नि गोइङ अन अराउन्ड भन्नेले पो सिक्रा हुन्छ त टिचरले के भन्नुभयो अथवा बुकमा के लेखाएको छ लर्निङ हुने होइन नि त हामीले त्यसलाई लर्निङ भन्न ठाने कि राखेको छ त हामीले वातावरणको महत्त्व भन्ने बुकहरू भनेर टाइपको जहिले पनि आर्गुमेन्ट हुन्छ नि करिकुलममा राखेर त लर्निङ हुँदैन नि त अनि दोस्रो कुरा चाहिँ तिमीले जुन इन्टिग्रेटेड भन्यो नि सायद लाइक हामीले रिसाइकल गर्ने चिज सिकेको भए त्यही साइन्स पनि सिकिसकेका हुन्थ्यो होला मेबी त्यही कुनै चिज बनाउनु पनि सिक्थ्यो होला त्यो एन्टायर प्रोसेस पनि सिक्थ्यो होला अनि त्यसको महत्त्व पनि इन्टरनलाइज गर्थ्यो होला अनि मैले एउटा प्लास्टिक थ्रो गर्दाखेरि कहाँ कसरी समस्या आउँछ भन्ने कुरा नि बल्ल एक्सपिरियन्स गरेर अनि त्यसको हुन्छ नि त्यसले बल्ल अडप्ट गर्थ्यो होला नि त होइन अब हामी कहाँ त त्यो नै भएन नि त किनभने स्कुलकै अराउन्डमै प्लास्टिकहरू जथाभावी फ्यालेको प्लास्टिकहरू जथाभावी युज गरेको पानीहरूलाई जथाभावी युज गरेको देखिसके पछाडि त नेचर इम्पोर्टेन्ट छ भन्ने कुरा त कसरी बुझ्छ होला र
अनि त्यो चाहिँ त्यही कुरामा चाहिँ क्लासरुम र बियोन्ड क्लासरुम कन्भर्सेसन पनि के अब जस्ट बिकज यु डु द्याट इन द क्लासरुम आई बिन टु स्कुल्स होइन अब पर्टिकुलर किन्डर गार्डनहरू चाहिँ चिटिक्क पुरा नेचरको त्यो जनावर कहिले नदेखेको जनावर हुन्छ होइन तर यु जस्ट स्टेप आउट होइन अब त्यही स्कुलको ठ्याक्कै बाहिर दे विल बी लाइक 10 स्ट्रिट डग्स they will never have a conversation on what it means to have street dogs in this country होइन तर they will have all these like case studies अथवा like stories about lions and tigers and leopards and all these things
which they have never like seen
never experienced never like so I guess it goes back to the fundamental question of what does nature mean होइन what does nature mean in a place like Kathmandu and it's a really good question. I was part of the Jane Goodall Foundation को कामहरू गर्थेँ म when I was at university अनि Jane's like I mean a lot of environmentalists know a lot about her. So she's like the foremost expert on knowledge on animals, and like nature and the work she's done is amazing. And I was in Abu Dhabi, and we had 2 workshops. Okay, and the workshop was all centered around what does nature mean to you. Abu Dhabi ma, when you ask that question, it's a desert, right? So when you ask that question to little kids, उनीहरूको first कुरा चाहिँ there's no nature around me भनेर भन्थ्यो कि सबैले होइन first उनीहरूको without any giving them any that's their thing that's the first thing. And most of it is because it's also a very international crowd. तर त्यो slowly अझै त्यो बच्चाहरूसँग काम गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ then I realized for a lot of people greenery is associated with nature. होइन हरियो रुख हुनु पर्यो अथवा हिमाल हुनु पर्यो पहाड हुनु पर्यो right तर in the UAE greenery is not nature. In fact I mean it's actually bad for the environment if you're planting non-native trees because it consumes more water होइन तर अब UAE जस्तो ठाउँमा चाहिँ नेचर भने के हो बालुवा नै नेचर हो नि होइन यहाँ नेपालमा क्लाइमेट चेन्ज हिमालयसमा किन पग्लिन्छ भनेर people talk about it. And I actually wrote a paper on the third pole and apparently there's sand particles that fly from Saudi Arabia होइन अनि Africa and the Middle East यहाँसम्म अनि they're flying high up and they go clash in the mountains.
Seriously?
Yeah. So I've written an article on this on the third pole. It's a peer-reviewed science. ISIMO's published on this. And the sand particles are causing climate change in Nepal. Right? On sand, I've read a book on sand and people should read more about sand. It's like fascinating. Eh? That's nature as well. So I think the entire conversation of what does nature mean to you भन्ने कुरामा पनि हामी जङ्गलै चढ्नु पर्दैन होइन हामी डाँडातिरै जानु पर्दैन like हाम्रै सराउन्डिङमा पनि there are like bits and pieces of nature that we forget in the bigger sort of picture.
जस्तो काठमाडौँ जस्तो स्कुल्स अब ठाउँमा स्कुल्सहरू छ अब तिमीले भनेको जस्तै नेचर लाइक हुन्छ नेचर भने के हो भनेर कन्टेक्चुअल डेफिनेसन्सहरू पनि चाहिन्छ भनेर होइन र त्यसलाई अडप्ट गर्नुपर्छ त्यो हो भने अलिकति मोर प्र्याग्मेटिक ढङ्गले कुरा गर्नुपर्दा काठमाडौँ जस्तोमा काठमाडौँमा रहेका स्कुल्सहरूले चाहिँ नेचरलाई इन्टिग्रेट गर्नु पर्यो भने कसरी गर्न सक्छ होला
I mean that's a great question and thanks for asking that because I think nature interaction with kuramma it's very easy to have a very privileged conversation. Okay? It's very easy because I can afford a mountain bike and I can go to the mountains. I can afford a pair of running shoes. I can go run. You know? I can afford the time and the luxury to leave and go do that. And it's something I'm very conscious about, okay? Because I think oftentimes it can be a very, very privileged conversation. And there's a very strong justice element to it. And just to set the context, it's not just in Kathmandu. Globally, अब मैले अघिकै दिएको स्ट्याट्समा 23% of young people these days experience nature. But within that 23%, people from marginalized communities, people of color, like America, for example, they get to experience nature less than like majority populations. त्यसमै पनि like war-torn areas like Syria, हुन्छ नि, like a lot of the countries where they're experiencing turmoil and stuff, it's even more difficult. त्यही कुरामा then there's the urban-rural landscape को कुरामा where urban spaceमा maybe nature is like a blessing for a lot of people. But rural areas, maybe nature is a disguise for a lot of people, right? So I think just want to say those things in terms of the context of nature means different things for different places, and we need to acknowledge the privilege and the justice element to nature. And having said that context, to answer your question, multiple layers, and I think about policy level, I think there needs to be a lot in terms of हाम्रो educational policies, हाम्रो curriculum, हाम्रो pedagogy देखि लिएर, the books people are reading, young kids, the stories that are like being told, teacher training, how do you incorporate nature into curriculum? And this is like in classroom curriculum, right? How do we perceive nature? And I think there's so many like ways through which, and there's so many examples we can have. It gets a bit trickier when you are talking about experiential education because not everyone would have the resources to get out and experience nature. I know, and it's not just about having your one outing in 6 months, but it's having more systematic, holistic level experience. And I think त्यसमा चाहिँ अब we need to acknowledge the reality, and some schools might have that opportunity to do more of that. And this really has to be designed from schools itself, I think. I don't think we can sit here and tell them, Sabitana is to go to, right? I think an element of that also has to come from एकदमै thorough reflection of what can be done in the existing space. होइन? So for example, if there's a school, एउटा building, केही पनि ground छैन भने, maybe you can go outside a couple of times. तर maybe you can also like create green buildings. होइन? अनि one example that I love giving is my first time university जाँदाखेरि सबैजनालाई बसमा राखेर they took us to like the apartment move in गर्दाखेरि they were like, what do you want to get? Everyone wants to go to IKEA, everyone wants to go get a furniture, get a sofa, get a this, that. होइन? अनि बसमा आउँदाखेरि चाहिँ सबै युरोपियन्स अमेरिकन्सहरू चाहिँ सबैजना प्लान्ट बोकेर आएको छ क्या होइन अनि सबै अरू डेभलपिङ कन्ट्रिजहरूको अब I'm sorry I'm generalizing होइन तर like it's true
in general,
it's visible in general होइन a lot of these people Europeansहरू they're buying plants and they know so much about plants अनि म चाहिँ अब हामी नभनौँ म चाहिँ होइन फर्निचर टेबल त्यो एकदम materialistic क्या so that's an example of like हुन्छ नि what in classroom पनि as opposed to having a lot of different things having like plants having like green spaces within buildings and that has a strong climate component as well okay because अहिले जति घाम भइरहेछ नि if you have like more greenery within buildings it's a cooling effect okay अब काठमाडौँमा पनि मोक्ष अगाडि त्यो इन्टायर ज्ञान मण्डलामा माथिदेखि त्यो के अरे प्लान्ट्सहरू झर्छ क्या the buildings are cooler होइन so like plants are and trees are the biggest best coolers we have globally so even in the face of climate change even in the face of यही हिसाबले if we're experiencing global warming in Kathmandu is going to get hotter and hotter. We're talking in summer where like last week 37 degrees in Kathmandu. होइन? Schools are going to have to put ACs. Right? So even from an economic angle, if they're going to invest more in greenery, it makes like logical energy security, energy sense पनि के? Right? So I think त्यो नेचरको कुरामा चाहिँ it's एकदमै multifaceted त्यही भएर so even for schools that maybe can't afford to have kids go out natureमा I think they can do a lot of things within the schools within sort of like हुन्छ नि the documentary students are watching and stuff like that अनि अर्को त sorry I'm talking too much on this तर last thing that I want to also comment on is internet and the internet has a big role to play in connecting us with nature okay and there's a lot of science behind this as well at this point and Google Earth let's say I don't know how much like you're aware of Google Earth and the platforms they have this virtual nature tours platform okay so you can like have a virtual tour of Everest and you can have a virtual tour of the Amazon and there's research to suggest that when people do virtual tours maybe it's not as experiential as being there in person but that's not pragmatic all of the time and your question was on pragmatism maybe these virtual tours are a good way of introducing these concepts in areas I know like where internet is so penetrated okay so I think there's a multifaceted approach that needs to be taken both in terms of experiential learning in terms of what schools can do in terms of their energy usage how schools look how buildings are but also in terms of how do we leverage things like the internet things like social media you know pen pals for example एउटा अर्को एकदमै हेल्प हुने मेन्टल हेल्थको लागि चाहिँ नेचर जर्नल भन्दो रहेछ कि सो किड्स राइट अ जर्नल अन देयर इन्टरेक्सन विथ नेचर अब शनिबार पिकनिक गयो भने के देख्यो कुन रुख देख्यो कुन स्पिसिसको रुख देख्यो थिङ्स लाइक द्याट सो आइएम सरी इफ आइम नट गिभिङ अ भेरी कन्क्रिट एन्सर राइट तर इट हेज टु बी एकदमै मल्टिफेसेटेड द्याट इज टेलर टु द युनिक सिचुएसन अफ द्याट स्कुल अनि कग्निसेन्ट अफ हुन्छ नि लाइक अ लट अफ डिफ्रेन्ट थिङ्स इन्क्लुडिङ लेभल अफ इन्कम इन्क्लुडिङ द प्रिभिलेज इन्क्लुडिङ एक्सेस अनि इन्क्लुडिङ एभ्रिथिङ
But then like हुन्छ नि अब म एजुकेटर भएर आई क्यान रियली लाइक हुन्छ नि सेन्स कि हामी एजुकेटरमै त्यो कतिको कन्सियसनेस छ त त्यसप्रतिको लगाव हामीमै कति छ भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ धेरै फरक पर्छ नि त होइन हामी नै कति बुझ्छौँ कति एप्रिसिएट गर्छौँ भन्ने कुराहरू होइन
अनि त्यसमै त्यसमै एप्रिसिएट मात्र नभएर पनि म त फाइनेन्स इकोनोमिक्स ब्याकग्राउन्ड भएर होला इट अल्सो हेज टु मेक अ फाइनेन्स इकोनोमिक्स केस भन्छु क्या म होइन बिकज as an educator, sure you're an educator, but you also are pressured. I know because you have to like pay the bills, you have to provide quality education. Inflation's high; it's increasing every year. You have to pay this everything. So, you also have to make an economic sense. So मेरो चाहिँ I am an environment economist, which is where I link environment, climate, and the economy and financing, right? So I do think अहिलेको situationमा greening makes financial sense. That's for schools. Maybe that's not a common knowledge, and maybe that's where like people like me need to do better in terms of like saying this out and educating people that going green has like
business case.
Right.
Maybe like काठमाडौँमा झनै धेरै यसको महत्त्व मैले किन पनि देखेँ भने हाम्रो जति पनि हुन्छ नि कल्चरल हेरिटेज अनि त्यसपछि हैन तिम्रो नेचुरल हेरिटेज भनौँ न बागमती सभ्यता भन्छ हैन यत्रो सराउन्डिङमै यस्तो धेरै राम्रो उपत्यका भयो हैन यत्रो राम्रो पहाड जङ्गलहरू छ तर हामी कतिको कग्निजेन्ट छौँ त यसको महत्त्व हैन यसको यो भन्ने कुराहरू हाम्रै आँखा अगाडि बागमती यसरी फोहोर भएर गइरहेछ हामीले कसरी कन्ट्रिब्युट गरेर छौँ त अझै पनि खासमा नेगेटिभली भन्ने कुराहरूलाई एजुकेसनले अझै बढी सेन्सिटिभ तरिकाले युज गर्न सक्यो भनेदेखि चाहिँ राम्रो हुन्थ्यो होला जस्तो मलाई लाग्छ हैन
I think हजुरको generation is the most important in this, के हाम्रो भन्दा पनि. And that's because your generation is the one that grew up in nature. Whether you're from Kathmandu or you're from outside of Kathmandu, which makes this beautiful city the way it is, right? The diversity. But we've lived in nature. Kathmandu pani, like if you look at photos from 30 years ago, it's gorgeous. Bagmati is like clean. हैन अब maybe मेरो generation अझै मेरो कम generationमा काठमाडौँमै हुर्केकोहरू we started losing that already. बच्चैदेखि नै there was a bit of something was happening. Also like हुन्छ नि the civil war and all of that, right? तर हजुरहरूको generation चाहिँ I think you've really seen and benefited from nature, के हैन and you've seen how it's being deteriorated as well. So I think त्यो कुरामा चाहिँ अब त्यो how do we create that sense of ownership अनि how do you incentivize that and how do you nudge people to alter behavior? And nudging is a एकदमै strong foundation in environmental economics. Nudging incentives, what works, what doesn't work, like putting a dustbin works or not, putting a tax works or not, putting a fine works, and there are different policy solutions on how people can be nudged. So that needs to be contextualized in a Nepalko conversation. Right. So I think education obviously plays a big role. But sorry to say this, but it also takes time. I know when you start from scratch. But it needs to be complemented. It cannot run in isolation. It needs to be complemented by other measures like nudging, other measures like incentives, other measures like robust infrastructure for waste. Media plays a huge role. Like TV series that we watch, like Nepal May, like things that we listen to, like everything. So I think, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think like, again, I keep on going back to this holistic lens of not one solution is going to work, but I think we need like a plethora of solutions with education at its core. And like education sort of becomes the distributing arm for a lot of different
catalyst
things. Exactly, catalyst. That's the word.
अर्को पनि चाहिँ एजुकेसनको महत्त्व नि अर्ली एजबाट जति फर्मेटिभ स्टेजमा जे ह्याबिट्सहरू जे कन्सियसनेस जे माइन्डसेट बन्छ त्यो चाहिँ धेरै द्याट स्टेज नि त
And that's where it starts because there's research to suggest that when you're young, that's when you're emotionally connected, right? Like the most passionate people are young people.
Even for that matter, like the test board, हामी जुन अर्ली एजमा खान्छौँ त्यही चाहिँ हामीलाई पछिसम्म नि मनपर्छ भन्छ नि सो अर्को मलाई अलिकति इन्ट्रेस्टिङ कुरा तिमीले एउटा कुनै कन्भर्सेसनमा हामी गफ गर्दाखेरि भनेको थियो कि तिमीलाई बिकज युआर लाइक नेचर लभर आउटडोर लाइक हुन्छ नि इन्थुजियास्ट अनि त्यस पछाडि त्यो कम्युनिटी पनि हुन्छ नि तिम्रो सर्कल पनि त्यस्तै होस् भन्ने सो द्याट त्यो कुरा अब त्यही चिजमा विदेशको मान्छेहरू भेट्दा चाहिँ यु क्यान इजिली गेट अलङ दे रियली अप्रिसिएट दे आर हुन्छ नि एडभेन्चरस अनि आउटडोर इन्थुजियास्ट त्यस्तो यस्तो हुने तर नेपालमा चाहिँ अझै अलिकति त्यस्तो कुराहरू पाउन गाह्रो छ भने त्यो त्यसको के होला रुट कज भने अलिकति
No, thanks for bringing it up. I don't know how to say it sensitively. But I've really struggled. And it's not just about not finding nature lovers in this country. I think you have that plenty. There's like, I think we have a lot of people who are like, we've made a career out of being in nature. We have scientists, we have environmentalists, we have tour guides, like travel, like tourism. So I think it's big. But मेरो context, and I think maybe it's a very, very personal thing. मेरो context, to find people based in Kathmandu, working, let's say, in economics or finance or business or any other like non-nature field, right? Ani त्यो community को people interested in nature चाहिँ where I can have that professional association of म त tour guide हैन नि त दाइ म त जहिले अब त्यहाँ जान त मिलेन Monday to Friday I have to like do my desk job which I love हैन तर त्यो community मा चाहिँ so finding people who are professionally aligned with me as well as they're like nature lovers say I have struggled personally and I don't want to generalize that as we don't have those people अनि काठमाडौँमा पनि I have mostly found that with the expat community. Right? So expat community, it's easier if I say, hey, like, do you want to go for a bike ride? Then they're going to be like, yeah, sure. Right? So I can go for a bike ride with these people because they learn how to ride a bike at a very young age. If it's my friends who grew up in, I don't know, like Jalakil Chok, maybe have never learned how to ride a bike. Of a सबसे big example, swimming. I know, like, but for me to say, hey, like, I really want to go swim, like, I struggle finding, like, yeah, I know, मान्छेहरू who are like, okay, let's go for a swim. But like, so naturally, like, मेरो inclination say, it's become easier to find two like-minded people with the international circle. And I'll just comment on that it's not just Nepalma, के म university पढ्दाखेरि पनि दुईटै undergradमा mastersमा I realized Europeans, and there's a lot of research to suggest why Europeमा चाहिँ pedagogy नै, अब you studied in Scandinavia, Norway, right? Like Norwayमा, Finlandमा, like it's like schools need to be around nature. हैन? That's how you grow up. You need to learn these basic skills. तर युनिभर्सिटीमा पनि so I have Norwegian friendsहरू, they're like always out. अब I have like अब के अरे नेपालको साथीहरू अथवा अरू डेभलपिङ कन्ट्रिजको साथीहरू, they've never experienced that, they've never understood the importance. So most of मेरो त्यो फ्रेन्ड्सहरू चाहिँ त्यही अनुसारको हुँदो रहेछ कि. अनि I think I just want to sort of put a disclaimer that I'm not saying one is good or bad. But what I'm saying is there's such a big discrepancy on how nature is valued in different parts of the world. And I think that's sad to me. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. But what I want to say is it's sad that we don't have that experience and we don't have that attachment and that love. And
so
some other people
मेरो त्यसमै प्रश्न पनि थियो कि so do you think it does have with the education to सुरुकै फाउन्डेसनले गर्दाखेरि त्यसको इम्प्याक्ट हैन?
I think education, again, it's not just classroom education, they're also family, right, culture. And I mean, I'm sure you have examples from like your time in Scandinavia as well, right? Like, I don't know how you experience that. Like, I personally think. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And what an irony, हैन? नेपाल चाहिँ प्रकृतिले धनी देश अनि नेपाल चाहिँ हिमालय यस्तो प्रकृतिको हुन्छ नि उच्च देन भएको देशमा नै हामी डिट्याच छौँ भने त्यो त अलिकति राम्रो त भएन एक. दोस्रो चाहिँ फेरि हामी अर्कोतिर के भन्न छौँ भने हाम्रो सबसे ठुलो एसेट भनेको नेचुरल रिसोर्सेसहरू हो हैन, नेचर हो. त्यसलाई हामीले क्यापिटलाइज पनि गर्नुपर्छ एज एन इकोनोमिस्ट पनि हैन. तिमीले चाहिँ एन्भाइरोमेन्टल इकोनोमिस्ट भने जस्तो झन् नेचर इकोनोमिस्ट नै भयो हैन. त्यसलाई एनक्यास गर्नुको लागि त त्यसकै अराउन्डमा हाम्रो सबै चिज हुनुपर्ने नि त हैन. नेचरकै अराउन्डमा त्यसलाई अप्रिसिएट गर्ने, त्यसलाई माया गर्ने, त्यसलाई अझै नर्चर गर्ने हुनुपर्नेमा हामी ठ्याक्कै उल्टा छौँ क्या. द्याट इज रियली रियली स्याड है.
It's very sad. अनि I mean, I can give so many examples of how like we prioritize infrastructure, हैन? How म त like त्यो यस्तो हुँदो रहेछ कि like when you have these silos, the nature lovers can't have a conversation with the economists because the economists think in a very different lens compared to the nature lovers, हैन? त्यो एकदम आइसोलेसन भयो कि, right? अनि अब त्यो you talk to एकदम स्पेशलिस्ट पनि धेरै भयो क्या. Like you talk to infrastructure specialist and it's all about I care about infrastructure, I don't care about trees.
Very
narrow vision, right? अनि the problem is then it becomes a debate on perspectives. So then we don't realize perspectives are shaped by our biases, and our biases are shaped by where we have studied. Our biases are shaped by like what we've learned. Like it's crazy. I mean, you can literally say where someone's done a PhD based on their perspectives. Okay?
Right. मलाई चाहिँ ठिक छ. हामीले we talked about the government policies, we talked about how school administration and school management has to look at the हुन्छ nature and how they can integrate भनेर. तर एकजना यङ स्टुडेन्टले चाहिँ कसरी irrespective of how the like school is and education system is and the government policy is, उसले चाहिँ कसरी त्यो नेचर लभ डेभलप गर्ने र त्यसबाट उ गर्न सक्छ होला भन्ने कुरा हुन्छ अलिकति.
No, that's a great question. I think I'll go as far as to argue that children innately and inherently love nature.
Right.
I know we have a fascination towards nature because it like triggers our senses, like it's different colors, like it triggers different parts of our brains. अनि बच्चा बेला हामी पनि like बाहिर गएर खेल्न पाउँदाखेरि like that's the best feeling ever. Everyone wants to go out and play. So I think young people and kids have it in them, okay? But because the framework and the environment is so different that it gets stolen away from them at some point. Right? So I do think a critical part for young people, and I'm not a big fan of giving like high level things that people can't do. Right? Into like low hanging fruits that we can actually implement in our daily lives. I think for me that reflection is key. I think we need to sit down and reflect, हुन्छ नि, like what does nature mean to us? Why does it matter? What are like some of our fond memories from growing up? And stuff. And we're still doing that, right? But I think we really need to sort of reflect and sort of like ask ourselves, what does nature mean to us? And how do we want to be a part of nature growing up? And I think maybe it's not like a big solution. But I do think once we reflect that, and it's not about reflect in 10 minutes. It's about like a long process of where we see ourselves in this conversation. And I think the answer will come to young people by themselves, right? And maybe it's different. And it has to be different for everyone. Okay? It can't be like a one-size-shoe-fits-all policy. It has to be a decentralized experience that is tailored to everyone. Maybe I love running 50 kilometers in nature. Not everyone's going to love that. Maybe someone else just loves like sitting in a park and this, but like writing poetry. And I just want to say like people like Milan Dai, Milan Rai. Like, I mean, the work he's doing is incredible, okay? The way he's like trying to create like your urban space conversation about park, about nature, about urban spaces, about urban green spaces. So my way of saying is only once we reflect, Milan Dai, when it's come after a lot of reflection, only once we reflect, we can incorporate climate, we can import greenery, nature into our work. Either as an economist, either as an urban planner, either as a doctor doing like amazing work in the Himalayas and in nature, as nature workers, like every field, educators. So I think only when we reflect as young people, then we can come up with like long-lasting solution, both in terms of our experiencing with nature personally, but also professionally. How do we incorporate that? And I think only then we stand a chance in protecting nature. Because other than that, no like one solution is going to work.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rashtra, for your time and एकदमै enthusiastic and this insightful. मैले त धेरै नै कुराहरू सिकेँ र धेरै रिफ्लेक्ट पनि गरेर थिएँ. अब हाम्रै आफ्नै मैले पनि एज एन एजुकेटर कसरी त्यो कुरालाई इन्कर्पोरेट गर्ने होला भनेर. थ्याङ्क यू सो मच.
थ्याङ्क यू सो मच फर ह्याभिङ मी. प्लेजर.
हस् त आज हामीले एकजना एन्भाइरोमेन्टल इकोनोमिस्ट एन्ड आउटडोर एन्थुजियास्ट राष्ट्र राज भण्डारीसँग हाउ वी क्यान इन्कर्पोरेट नेचर into our education system and nurture it in the students भन्ने कुराहरू डिस्कस गऱ्यौँ. आगामी अङ्कमा नयाँ अतिथि र नयाँ सब्जेक्ट लिएर आउने नै छौँ. त्यतिन्जेलको लागि बिदा दिनुहोस्. हस् त, नमस्कार.
www.nepalwatch.com